There are multiple generations of DC Comics fans whose Flash is not Barry Allen. It is, in fact, Wally West. Barry Allen had been gone for quite some time. Wally West stepped up to the plate, took over the Flash mantle, and in some ways that I certainly understand, people would say that Wally West had a better publishing history once he became the Flash than certainly some of what Barry Allen was doing during the Silver Age. But the Silver Age of DC Comics was much different from the Bronze Age. But certainly Wally West had stepped up. Kyle Rayner had stepped up as the new Green Lantern after Hal Jordan had died. And Geoff Johns was clearly an enormous fan of the Silver Age of DC Comics. One of the first things he does is reestablish Superman as like the Silver Age Superman, kind of mind wiping or erasing a lot of the work that one John Byrne had done in Man of Steel. But he also did Green Lantern Rebirth, bringing Hal Jordan back from the dead and reestablishing him as the number one Green Lantern. But he also had Flash Rebirth, bringing Barry Allen back from the dead, even though he had one of the greatest, most heroic deaths in comic book history, and reestablishing him as the primary Flash in the DC universe. When we get to Flashpoint and we get into the New 52, Wally West was essentially expunged from history. He never existed, but we were hinted at the end of New 52 that Wally might still be around. There might be something to that, and Geoff Johns decided to make a do-right and actually listen to people who were clamoring and wanting Wally West to return to the DC Comics universe. Geoff Johns brought Wally back in DC Universe Rebirth #1 after he had been lost in the Speed Force for 10 years following Flashpoint. In one of the most emotional moments in DC history, Barry Allen finally remembers Wally and pulls him back to Earth Prime in a heartfelt embrace. DC fans were overjoyed as Wally became the new symbol of hope, embodying the promise of DC Rebirth to restore legacy and optimism. His story continued in the criminally underrated Titan series by Dan Abnett and Brett Booth, where Wally joined his friends for a brief moment. DC had successfully reunited all the best versions of its heroes in one unified timeline, and fans were all in. DC Rebirth, as far as modern comic books, I think is the best period of time for DC fans. All the best versions of all of their heroes basically occupying the same exact universe, interacting with each other, having adventures together. And the return of Wally West was the ultimate piece of fan service from Geoff Johns, returning him in one of the most emotional moments really in comic book history. I still remember getting that page, Barry going, "Oh, I can't, how could I have ever forgotten you?" Brings him back. They hug, they're just crying tears. And then we start to get some hints at what happened to Wally West. He says, it wasn't actually like Flashpoint that brought me out and sent me in the Speed Force for 10 years. There's actually somebody behind the scenes that's doing stuff that was erasing history, and that's why you didn't remember me. It wasn't your fault. Of course, we all end up finding out that that was Dr. Manhattan. Remember those big revelations in Doomsday Clock when it felt like Wally is going to be this enormous part of Doomsday Clock? Obviously, Geoff Johns had really big plans for him. And we got that revelation that he had escaped from the Speed Force in Doomsday Clock and confronted Dr. Manhattan and said, "I know what you're doing." And you find out it was Dr. Manhattan that, basically perpetrated Flashpoint and created the New 52 universe and all that stuff. It was so mind-blowing and enormous. And it was pretty clear at the time that Geoff Johns had massive, massive plans for Wally West in Doomsday Clock. But it was delayed massively. It kept getting delayed and more delayed and more delayed. And all of a sudden, Wally really wasn't in the story. He also seemed to have really big plans for Saturn Girl. There by the end, she's also kind of removed from the story. I'm assuming it's because they had other plans for Wally West, which we're about to get to. But I'm also assuming it's because Brian Michael Bendis, who had arrived at DC Comics, had other plans for Saturn Girl, like in Legion of Superheroes and stuff, which I'm not going to get to because that's a story for another day. But they had really big plans for Wally West. It was clear as day. And if you go read that Titan series, when Wally realizes that Linda doesn't remember him, and he doesn't want to bother her, he doesn't want to hurt her, he doesn't want to remind her of her children that she's also missing. And then he gets into the Speed Force again accidentally and is afraid that he's going to get lost in there again. And the Speed Force is like, "No, you should go out and reach to her. That love that you had with Linda can happen once again. She could feel that way for you again." And he finally goes and talks to her, and she's like, "Who is this guy?" But she's kind of curious, and obviously they start rekindling everything. Really, really great stuff. And it felt like Wally West was well on his way to being reestablished and was fundamentally the heart and soul and really that symbol of hope of DC Rebirth and everything that DC Rebirth really represented at the time. But unfortunately, there were all those delays that I did mention. And Doomsday Clock kept getting pushed out, and we were supposed to be getting Batman 3 Jokers after that. Jeff Johns had a big plan, but he had started doing some producing in Hollywood and stuff like that. He was no longer the chief creative officer at DC Comics that had already gone back to like Dan Didio and stuff like that. And then we got Dark Knight's Metal, and that was a huge hit. And Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo were delivering things on time where Doomsday Clock was getting pushed off. And they just went in an entirely new direction, and they took Wally with them. And it was clear that DC Comics were now going to go in a much different, much darker direction than Jeff Johns had set up with DC Rebirth. Brian Michael Bendis had arrived on the scene. Now he was doing Superman. Tom King's star had gotten to rise. All of a sudden, we got this Flash War event from Josh Williamson in his Flash book, where you had Wally and Barry kind of going at it because Wally wanted to go into the Speed Force and find Giant Iris, or perhaps go back in time and change the past, which Barry didn't want him to do. And at the end, he had to go to a little place called Sanctuary. And at the time, I didn't really like Flash War, but in retrospect, I absolutely hate it now because this happened. The optimism of Rebirth was shattered with Heroes in Crisis, a series that felt like a direct attack on fans who celebrated Wally's return. DC's favorite hatchet man, Tom King, made Wally a key figure in the story, which promised to explore superhero trauma but instead delivered a character assassination. Wally was revealed as the Sanctuary Killer, murdering dozens of heroes, including his close friend Roy Harper, before time traveling to kidnap and kill a variant of himself to frame Harley Quinn and Booster Gold. The story ended with Harley kicking Wally in the balls before his arrest, a humiliating low for DC's symbol of hope. Fans were appalled. When backlash erupted, King claimed DC had chosen Wally for this storyline, attempting to pass the blame for what many saw as pure character assassination. And I do distinctly remember, before getting into like Heroes in Crisis, because I actually like Roy Harper a lot. I definitely didn't like him dying in that story. I didn't like any of that story, but I definitely didn't like Roy Harper dying. But I always thought like Roy had gotten like the worst shake ever at DC Comics. You know, where he's speedy, he's Green Arrow's sidekick, he gets the big heroin addict storyline or whatever. And in that now iconic Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams, Green Arrow, Green Lantern run that they did back in the day. And then eventually, you know, he has a daughter, but then his daughter is brutally murdered. He has his arm ripped off, even though he's an archer, basically making him useless. And I was like, I don't think anybody could ever treat a character worse than fucking Roy Harper, the character that I like and was mostly invested in. And then Tom King said, well, fuck you, Wes. Hold my beer. I got some stuff in store for Wally West. And I still remember the moment of like reading that and realizing the implications, where you're seeing his face. There's like some blood splatter on those stupid panels that he was making Clayman do or whatever. I think it was Clayman, where it's like, I'm Wally West. I'm the fastest man alive. And this is my confession. And you realize he's the one that killed all of them, which, you know, at some point you could go, well, he didn't mean to. He was overcome by grief, and it, you know, overpowered the Speed Force and made him into a nuclear weapon. But then he went and like basically framed two innocent people for all those deaths and like killed himself, or another version of himself in the future that he went and kidnapped. You're like, oh yeah. Yeah, changing the crime scene, planting evidence. That's real fucking heroic. And a lot of people walked away from DC Comics, and a lot of people that were so happy when Wally returned in DC Rebirth just had their hearts ripped out and was beating right in front of their faces. Not in an awesome way like in Indiana Jones, but in a terrible way like this is the death of the character. And he's really struggled ever since to kind of come back to relevance and be redeemed. Not that they haven't tried mightily to do that. There have been attempts to do it, and I think they've been somewhat successful. Some more successful than others. The first big attempt to really fix Wally and redeem him came from underrated writer Scott Lobdell, alongside artist Brett Booth, who helped relaunch Wally in Rebirth, stepped in to redeem him in Flash Forward. Tempest Fugonaut offered Wally a chance to atone by stopping the dark multiverse from overtaking reality. Wally ultimately sacrificed everything, taking the Mobius chair to save the multiverse, knowing it would erase his memories of his wife, Linda, and his children, Jai and Iris. While his family was restored, Wally was left isolated, unable to remember them, proving his heroism, but at a devastating personal cost as he sought to erase the stain of being labeled a murderer. It was a painful but heroic act, proving once and for all that Wally West wasn't a murderer, but still one of DC's greatest heroes. And I still remember when he finally finds Jai and Iris, when Flash Forward. Just really good stuff by Scott Lobdell. It's probably my favorite thing that he's ever written, although I know a lot of X-Men fans will disagree with me. And obviously great work by Brett Booth, but Brett Booth only does amazing work. Essentially everything that he does looks amazing. He could, illustrate a pack of cigarettes and make you want to smoke. That's how good his art is. But I remember Wally finding Jai and Iris, and reconnecting with them, and then sacrificing his relationship with them and Linda, basically to save the entire universe as like penance for what had happened, as the sanctuary killer or whatever, but also at the same time, restoring Jai and Iris back to the timeline and putting them back with their mother. So huge personal sacrifice, but also giving his children the mother that they lost, and the children that she had lost, reuniting them. So it was definitely heroic, but he was still a murderer. Like, this didn't remove any of the stain of Heroes in Crisis. It attempted to redeem the character by showing you, he's still a hero. He's willing to sacrifice the most important thing in the entire world, his relationship with his children and his wife, in the process to save the universe from the dark multiverse. Very, very effective stuff, but it didn't quite erase the stink of Heroes in Crisis. Josh Williamson, at the end of his Flash run, also goes back and starts to retcon Heroes in Crisis a little bit, introducing an element of one of the reasons that Wally decided to go and essentially frame those other people was the Reverse Flash had come and made him doubt himself. He didn't believe anyone would understand what happened. So it wasn't him in his right mind. He was being affected by a very negative, evil force upon him. Once again, not really wiping the stain of the murders out there, but trying to explain why he did that other stuff that was also very repugnant. Unfortunately, while he was on the Mobius chair, Scott Snyder apparently didn't like that. It did lead to like the best part of Dark Knight's Death Metal, like the follow-up event to Death Metal that kind of derailed Wally and basically the entire DC universe to begin with. Well, he needed like the Mobius chair to go over to like the Batman Who Laughs, who was essentially going to become like Dr. Manhattan, Batman, Joker guy. So we did get like a really cool like Flash on the Mobius chair, like mini-series. But then Scott, once he gets on there, he just kind of removes it from him and makes him kind of a chump, kind of lessening the impact of what Scott Lobdell had set up. And I do like to talk about Scott Lobdell not being a premier writer, or sometimes even saying he's not even a good writer. That is all in jest, because Doc is a good friend of mine, and Doc absolutely loves Scott Lobdell. The way he talks about Scott Lobdell, he's like a step below Chris Claremont, which I firmly disagree with. But I also think Scott Lobdell is actually pretty good. But that is like a running joke. So if you hear me say Scott Lobdell sucks, I don't actually mean it. I'm mostly just trying to make Doc mad. And I absolutely love what he did with Flash Forward. Unfortunately, that didn't fix everything. But the closest thing we actually have gotten to fully redeeming the character came in the form of a brand new writer to DC Comics that nobody had ever heard of. Jeremy Adams took over the Flash with a promise to spare Wally further trauma, and he delivered spectacularly. Adams reunited Wally and his family, Linda, Jai, and Iris, crafting the best Flash run in decades, filled with hope, family dynamic, and classic superhero fun. Wally once again became the DC Universe's symbol of hope and the ultimate family man, with his children developing superpowers and Linda gaining super speed due to her pregnancy. Fans began to believe DC had turned a corner, especially as sales rose, peaking with the 1 Minute War event, which saw significant increases in readership and renewed excitement for the character. It felt like DC had finally listened, giving Flash readers a reason to believe. And I came into this series exceptionally skeptical. First, I had never heard, really, of Jeremy Adams. I didn't know who he was. I was like, why are they putting him on the Flash? They were also annexing Barry Allen. This was kind of during the Future State or whatever that thing after that was. This was like during the Infinite Frontier era, where Barry Allen went to like the dark side of the moon to monitor the dark multiverse. Remember they had that team with like heroes and villains working together? Barry was like the Justice League attaché, like fucking representing them on that group that never did anything. So Wally became the primary Flash again, which I thought probably wasn't the greatest idea because the character had been tainted so bad. And I didn't know who Jeremy Adams was. So I was exceptionally cynical. And I didn't even read the book at first, to be completely honest. It took a few months of people saying, hey, this Wally West Flash book from Jeremy Adams is actually pretty good. So you know what? I kind of trust a few of these people. So I go back and I check it out. And Jeremy Adams had delivered essentially everything that he said he was going to do. He had restored the Wally West that everyone loved from the Bronze Age, but then even made him better, where he was like the ultimate family guy. Like he's always out there with his kids and trying to help them learn the Speed Force. All that stuff that we wanted from Superman with John Kent, we are actually getting once again with Jai and Iris. And then next thing you know, Linda had super speed. And I was like, come on, man, don't give the love interest super speed. I'm so tired of love interest also becoming super powered. But then you get the reveal that the reason she has super speed is because she was pregnant and she was getting it from the baby. So even in that case, I was like, hey, that's actually kind of genius. It really makes sense. And it puts an end date, a finite ending on her having super speed. And it was just like a book that the entire family could read and enjoy. And it's something that DC had not had really since Super Sons. You know, it had been a few years since that book had basically been erased from existence. And nobody was talking about it. And a few issues into his run, we start recommending it here on the channel, talking about how spectacular it was. I wish I had put an even bigger spotlight on it because the sales didn't like start increasing immediately. But they did start going up. But it was very faint at first because Jeremy Adams, quite frankly, was an unknown quantity within comic books. But then the momentum like just kind of got there. Everybody started talking about how great this Wally West run from Jeremy Adams was, and we were coming up to this 1 Minute War event. This contained event story within the Flash series with like all the Flash family and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think 1 Minute War is the best thing that Jeremy Adams did in Flash, like by far, but it was still good. And all of a sudden the sales were there. You could see it was just like bouncing and going up and was really gaining all this momentum. And people finally had started to forgive DC Comics. I remember Sully, you know, friend of the channel, he wasn't really on the comics aficionados yet, but he took Heroes in Crisis personally. He stopped reading DC Comics after that, but he would follow the channel and he saw that we kept recommending Jeremy Adams' Flash run. And after like a year, he finally decided to check it out, or maybe it was a little bit longer than that. And he realized this was the Flash book that he always wanted. And, you know, we went back and caught up and everything like that. So people that had essentially turned their backs on DC Comics and certainly Flash after what happened in Heroes in Crisis let their guards down and started jumping in and discovering that this was a Flash book that they loved and that they were willing to give DC Comics a chance again. And I guess that was unfortunate. Just as the momentum picked up, DC pulled the rug out again. Jeremy Adams was unceremoniously replaced by Cy Spurrier, whose run began with a grim cosmic horror reinterpretation that erased the tone and heart fans had just embraced. Wally was portrayed as distant and inattentive to his family, completely at odds with the loving father figure Adams had reestablished. Spurrier's run introduced incomprehensible concepts like the stillness and an overpowered Wally who could teleport by not moving. The run is a mess, nonsensical writing, confusing art by Mike Deodato Jr., and a complete betrayal of Wally's character. Fans, myself included, felt duped after believing DC was committed to saving Wally. Once more, Wally West became a symbol not of hope, but of DC's ongoing failure to commit to its legacy heroes. The tragedy of Wally's post-Rebirth arc isn't just what he endured on the page, it's what fans were made to endure watching it all unfold. And it did almost feel like a personal attack when they said Jeremy Adams was leaving. You know, you throw a lot of your heart and soul in the character, but here on the channel, I was doing my best to get the word out. A lot of people were doing their best to get the word out, and momentum had upticked, and they decided to go to Cy Spurrier. It just felt like a kick in the balls, to be completely honest. And then when you hear what he wants to do, it's going to go cosmic horror. i.e. the exact opposite of what Jeremy had done that really had reinvigorated or started to reinvigorate the title. I don't know that Flash would have jumped up and been like a perennial top 10 selling comic book in the industry if Jeremy had stayed on, but it did have a trajectory that suggested that could happen. And I don't know, maybe for some people, this final betrayal will be the last betrayal when it comes to DC Comics and Wally West. They're just not going to believe it. You know, you killed the character off, you dropped him from all continuity for 10 years, you reestablish him. He's the new symbol of hope. You make him a murderer, make him unredeemable, you try to redeem him, then you strip all that stuff off for Dark Knight's death metal. You restore the character with Jeremy Adams, get him back to a place where he should have been all along. And then once people finally believe again and they jump back in, you put Cy Spurrier on the book and ruin all momentum and just destroy the series sight unseen. Of course, he gets a #1, even though Jeremy Adams didn't. So I don't know how many more times DC fans or Wally West fans or Flash fans are going to forgive DC for constantly doing this to Wally, but I know I'm at my wit's end. The only good thing that came out of this, really, I guess, was discovering Jeremy Adams as a writer and realizing that he's definitely one of the best, if not the best, current writer at Marvel or DC. And while he certainly wasn't supposed to go on anything after Flash, there were no plans for it, things worked out, I guess, the way that they were supposed to. Mariko Tamaki couldn't meet her Green Lantern obligation. They had to remove her. Jeremy Adams picked up the phone, took the gig, got on Green Lantern. Obviously, it's doing very well. It's got a second title now that he's co-writing. Now he's also writing Aquaman, but he's also writing Flash Gordon. And his career is kind of skyrocketing. And at least for me, it kind of all starts with The Flash. Now, he did have, obviously, a lot of screenwriting credits for DC characters in television and movies and streaming and stuff like that. But he was a completely unknown quantity at DC Comics, and he almost did the unthinkable. He almost fully redeemed Wally West from the devastation of obviously Flashpoint, but certainly the even worse devastation that was Heroes in Crisis. And it's been a long, widening road that's been up and down and up and down, and we are certainly at a down. We're not at a Heroes in Crisis down, but we're certainly at a very down point for Wally West. I do hope DC does something to redeem the character, and me personally, I just would like Jeremy Adams to go back on the book and continue doing what he was doing, because that's the Wally West Flash story I think a vast majority of people actually wanted. If you appreciate this kind of analysis, kind of breaking down a character arc or the story of the character Wally West returning as the symbol of hope and then ultimately becoming a symbol of why you don't want to trust DC Comics with your favorite heroes, because they'll just break your heart, kid, and you'd like to be part of Think Critical YouTube family, there's one place to do that. That is Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's a button right here. And I do hope to see you there very, very soon.